She was 61 years old, alone on a mountain in the dead of a Colorado winter. With nothing to her name but the clothes on her back and a coat that was not warm enough. Her name was Selah Vane, and she had just been driven from her own home by her late husband's brother, a man named Thomas Vane, who told the sheriff she was unfit to keep the house and unfit to keep her mind, and who wanted the land for himself. She left with $4 sewn into her hem, a Bible that had belonged to her mother, and a stubbornness that would not let her lie down and die on the road, though there were nights that winter when dying might have been easier than walking. With the last of that $4, she bought a condemned railroad watchman's shanty at a tax auction in a town called Cutter's Notch, a leaning, forgotten box of a building at a place called Widow's Pass, sold for $2 because no one else wanted it, because everyone said it was cursed, because a man had gone missing there 30 years before and no one had ever explained why. She told herself it was foolish, that she was a foolish old woman spending her last coin on a shack the mountain wind went straight through. She did not know yet that inside its walls, sealed away in silence for a generation, was a secret the whole railroad had buried, one that would not only save her life, but restore an entire town that history, and greed, had tried to erase. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Selah Vane. If you're watching tonight from a place the world has written off as finished, tell us in the comments, because this story is for you. Selah had been born in 1826 in a river town in Missouri, the third daughter of a blacksmith named Amos Reed, a man who believed that a thing was only ever as worthless as the person who judged it. He kept a forge full of bent nails, cracked wheel rims, and broken tools that other men threw away, and he taught his daughters, all three of them, though it scandalized the neighbor women, that iron did not lie. A tool could look ruined and still hold its temper. A thing could be judged too quickly by people too proud, too tired, or too frightened to look closer. Selah grew up with soot under her fingernails and an ear trained to the particular ring of good steel, and though she married young and left the forge behind, she never left behind the lesson, that value hides, and that the world is full of people too busy to find it. She married Eli Vane in 1846, a quiet, careful man who worked first as a freight teamster and then, when the railroads began stitching themselves across the territories, as a surveyor's assistant, walking ahead of the steel with a chain and a notebook, marking where the rails would someday run. Selah went with him whenever she could, out to the raw edges of the country, and she came to know that world of graded track and timber trestles and canvas tent towns the way other women knew a kitchen. She learned to read a survey map. She learned the particular language of railroad men, cant and grade and right-of-way, and she learned, too, the particular cruelty of railroad companies toward the men who built them, especially the Chinese laborers who blasted the high passes and the Irish gandy dancers who laid the ties, men who were paid in scrip, in promises, in nothing at all when a company decided the books could be closed quietly. Eli and Selah never had children who lived past infancy, a grief that hollowed them both but never broke them, and in time they settled on a modest homestead outside a mountain town, where Eli's younger brother Thomas also kept land. Thomas had always resented that Eli was the elder, the trusted one, the one their father had favored, and he watched with poorly hidden envy as Eli and Selah built something steady and respected out of nothing. When Eli died of a fever in the winter of 1885, Thomas did not wait long to begin his campaign. He told the town that Selah, in her grief, had grown strange, that she walked the property talking to herself, that she kept odd hours, that a woman without a husband and without children had no business holding good land alone. It was not true, or no truer than grief makes any of us, but truth was never really the point. Thomas wanted the land, and a woman alone in 1887, however capable, however clear-eyed, was vulnerable to a man willing to lie loudly enough and often enough. What Selah carried through all of this, through the loss of her babies, through Eli's death, through the slow tightening of Thomas's schemes, was her father's old lesson, worn smooth as a river stone by then, that a thing dismissed by frightened or greedy people was not therefore worthless, only unseen. She had watched Eli map worthless-looking gulches that became the only passable grade through a mountain range. She had seen broken men, discarded by companies that used them up, hold on to more decency than the men who owned the rails. She did not know, as that hard winter began, that her father's lesson was about to be tested in the cruelest way she could imagine, and that it would also, eventually, be the very thing that saved her. The fall came fast, the way ruin often does, dressed up first as reasonable concern. Thomas Vane went to the county judge in the autumn of 1887 and swore, with 2 paid witnesses standing beside him, that Selah was incompetent to manage her late husband's estate. He produced no real evidence, only the testimony of men who owed him favors, and the quiet, ugly momentum of a town willing to believe that a 61-year-old widow, especially one who spoke her mind and had once corrected the county surveyor's own arithmetic in front of half the saloon, was better off looked after. The judge, a friend of Thomas's from a mining venture gone bad, signed the order in November. Selah was given 3 days to vacate the house she and Eli had built board by board, the orchard she had planted, the well she had dug with her own hands the summer Eli's back gave out. She did not go quietly. She stood in the county office and told the judge, in a voice that did not shake though her hands did, that she had read more survey maps than every man in that room combined, that she had kept her husband's accounts to the penny for 40 years, and that the only thing wrong with her mind was that it remembered too clearly who had lied. It did not matter. The order stood. On the 3rd day, in a hard early snow, Thomas himself came to see her off the property, and it was there, at the gate, that the story took its cruelest turn, the part the town would later be ashamed of and slow to admit. Thomas did not merely send her away. He told her, with the particular coldness of a man who has decided a person no longer counts as a person, that if she wanted shelter that night she could try the old section house up at Widow's Pass, 6 miles up a mountain road already choked with snow, in weather that any local man knew was about to turn to a full blizzard. He knew, and the 2 men who drove her cart knew, that the road was likely to be impassable by nightfall. They left her at the base of the grade with a blanket, a lantern with little oil, and no food, and they rode back down before the light failed. It was as near to leaving a woman for dead as a man could manage while still telling himself, in the privacy of his own conscience, that he had not quite done murder. Selah survived that night through nothing but the training her father had given her hands and the stubbornness he had given her spirit. She found the old section house, a squat, snow-buried box of a building the railroad had abandoned when the line was rerouted years before, and though the door was frozen shut, she worked it open with a fence stave, packed snow against the gaps in the walls the way she'd once seen surveyors do in a line camp, and burned what little dry lumber remained inside a rusted stove to see the night through. She did not die. She walked out the next morning, half frozen, into the town of Cutter's Notch, a rail depot town a few miles below Widow's Pass, and there, in the lobby of the tiny county courthouse annex, she learned that the very shack that had nearly killed her was, by strange coincidence, up for a delinquent tax sale that same week, the railroad having abandoned the deed decades before and let the back taxes pile up on a parcel nobody wanted. The clerk, a kind young man named Otis Pruitt, took pity on the frostbitten widow standing in his office and told her, half in jest, that she could have the whole worthless place for $2 if she wanted it, since no one else had bid. Selah thought of her father's forge, full of things other men had thrown away. She thought of the night she had just survived inside those very walls. And with the last of the $4 sewn into her hem, she bought Widow's Pass section house for $2, telling herself it was foolish, telling herself a woman with nothing should not be spending her last coin on a shack that had almost been her coffin. She did not yet know that the shack had also, once, been someone else's coffin of secrets, and that it had been waiting 30 years for someone with eyes trained not to dismiss what looked like ruin. She moved into the section house in December of 1887 with almost nothing, and the work of making it livable was itself a kind of mercy, because it kept her hands too busy to dwell on Thomas or the judge or the town that had let it happen. She patched the roof with tin scraps Otis Pruitt helped her scavenge from the rail yard. She scrubbed 30 years of soot from the little stove. And it was in clearing out a low cupboard built into the wall beside that stove, a cupboard so shallow it seemed to serve no purpose, that her father's old instinct made her pause. The back panel of the cupboard did not sit flush the way the others did. It was proud by the width of a fingernail, and when she pressed it, it gave, swinging inward on a hidden pivot to reveal a narrow cavity built between the wall studs, dry as a bone despite the mountain damp, clearly built with care and purpose by someone who understood construction the way a man who builds railroads understands construction. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff and yellow with age, she found a leather ledger book, a bundle of letters tied with waxed cord, and a small tin box that rattled faintly when she lifted it, too light to be coin, she thought, and she was right. The ledger's first pages were routine railroad bookkeeping, wages and freight tallies for a construction camp dated 1857, 30 years gone, but as she turned deeper into it by lamplight that first night, her surveyor's eye caught on entries that did not belong in ordinary bookkeeping, names, dozens of them. Chinese names rendered in a careful, respectful hand alongside sums of money, wages for blasting and grading the very pass her shack now sat upon, with a second column beside them marked, simply, withheld. The withheld sums were not small. Selah, who had kept Eli's accounts to the penny for 40 years, added the column in her head before she had even finished reading it and arrived at a number large enough to build a schoolhouse, or repair a town's entire rail spur, or change the fortune of every family whose name appeared in that ledger's careful hand. The letters told her why. They were written by a man named Josiah Kell, the section watchman who had lived in that very shanty and who had vanished, unexplained, in the autumn of 1857, the very disappearance that had given the place its reputation for being cursed. Kell had been more than a watchman, he had been the camp's paymaster's clerk, and in his letters, addressed to no one in particular, written as a man writes when he suspects he will not live to send them, he confessed that he had discovered his employer, the railroad's construction superintendent, a man named Elias Corbett, had been systematically withholding wages from the Chinese laborers who blasted Widow's Pass through solid granite at the cost of at least 9 lives. That Kell had personally counted, pocketing the difference for himself under the cover of wartime shortages and company retrenchment. Kell had begun quietly recording the true wages owed in a second ledger, meaning to send it to the railroad's Eastern Board once he had proof enough to be believed, because a mere clerk's word against a superintendent's was worth nothing on its own. He never got the chance. His last letter, dated 3 days before he disappeared, said that Corbett had grown suspicious of him, and that he intended to hide the ledger and the tin box, which, when Selah finally worked the tin box's stubborn latch, proved to hold not money but something almost more valuable, a set of surveyor's brass tokens and a hand-drawn map marking a specific stretch of the old grade where. Kell's final letter explained, a portion of the withheld wages had actually been buried in coin by Corbett himself, in a strongbox meant to be recovered once suspicion had cooled, wages Corbett intended to simply keep rather than ever pay out. Selah sat with that ledger in her lap long into the night, the little stove ticking as it cooled, and understood 2 things with the particular clarity of a woman who has just survived being left for dead by her own family. The first was that Josiah Kell had almost certainly been murdered for what he knew, and that his death had been dressed up for 30 years as a simple mountain disappearance, the same easy dismissal that had almost worked on her. The second was that the descendants of those withheld wages, Chinese families scattered by decades of exclusion and hostility, driven out of many mountain towns entirely in the years since, were very likely still owed a debt that no one alive had ever tried to collect, because no one had ever believed a laborer's grievance was worth the trouble of proving. She thought of her father's forge again, of iron that did not lie, and she understood that she was holding, in her chapped and frost-scarred hands, proof that could either vanish back into a wall for another 30 years, or become the instrument of a restoration no one in Cutter's Notch had thought possible. The deepening of the mystery did not stop at the ledger. Selah, with Otis Pruitt's help, the young clerk having taken a quiet, principled liking to the widow who'd been so wronged by his own courthouse, began tracing what had become of Elias Corbett and of the railroad line itself. She learned that Corbett had died in 1861, respected and prosperous, having parlayed his position into a lucrative freight contracting business, and that his fortune and his name had passed down through a single surviving line to a grandson, Silas Corbett, who now served, by an irony almost too neat to be believed, as the regional superintendent of the very rail company whose branch line ran through Cutter's Notch, the man who controlled whether the town's dying spur would be repaired and kept open or allowed to close, taking with it the freight trade that was the only thing keeping the town alive at all. Selah understood then that this was no longer a private matter of an old debt and an old grave. It was a live wound in the present, because Silas Corbett had spent 2 years quietly recommending to his company's Eastern Board that the cutter's notch spur be abandoned as unprofitable, a recommendation that would strip the town of its rail connection entirely and, not incidentally, would keep buried forever any inconvenient old business about his grandfather. She also found, through careful, patient asking around the rail yard and the boarding houses, that not every trace of the wronged laborers had vanished. An elderly man named Wing Lo, who ran a small laundry at the edge of Cutter's Notch and had lived quietly in the region for decades, turned out to be the son of one of the very men named in Kell's ledger, a man named Lo Fong, who had survived the blasting of Widow's Pass only to die young from injuries the work had left in his lungs, having never received a fair wage for the labor. Wing Lo had grown up on his mother's stories of a debt owed and never paid, stories the family had long since stopped hoping anyone would believe. When Selah showed him, with trembling care, the page bearing his father's name and the sum owed beside it, the old laundryman wept in a way that told her more plainly than any ledger could that this was not merely history. It was a wound that had never closed, carried quietly for 30 years by people the town had trained itself not to look at too closely, much, she thought, the way it had so recently trained itself not to look too closely at her. Silas Corbett did not remain ignorant of what the widow at Widow's Pass had found for long. Word traveled, as it does in small mountain towns, and when Corbett learned that Selah Vane possessed his late grandfather's private ledger, along with letters that all but named him a murderer's heir, he did not come to her with an accusation. He came with an offer, smooth and reasonable on its surface. He would personally see to it that the county overturned the incompetency ruling against her, that Thomas Vane's theft of her land was undone, that she would be made comfortable for the rest of her days, if she would simply hand over the ledger, the letters, and the tin box, and let an old, unfortunate misunderstanding stay buried where it had rested for 30 years. He framed it, without a trace of shame, as mercy toward an old woman who had already suffered enough, sparing her a fight with a railroad company that could crush her in court without even noticing the effort. Selah refused him, and she refused him in front of witnesses, because she had learned by then, at great cost, exactly how easily a woman alone could be made to disappear from a story if there was no one else present to remember what had been said. She told Corbett, with Otis Pruitt and Wing Lo both standing near enough to hear, that she had not survived a blizzard her own family had left her in only to be frightened into silence by a man who inherited his comfort from stolen wages and a dead clerk's grave. Corbett's manner changed after that. The reasonable offer became a quiet campaign of pressure. He leaned on the same county judge who had ruled Selah incompetent to have her declared unfit to hold property at all, effectively trying to seize Widow's Pass and everything hidden within it out from under her through the very legal weapon Thomas Vane had already used once. He spread word in town that the widow up at the old section house had gone half-mad hoarding a rusted tin box and a moldy old book, hoping to make her claims sound like the ravings the judge had already, once, been all too willing to believe. It might have worked, as it so nearly had before, except that Selah was no longer entirely alone, and except that she had learned something in 40 years of keeping a surveyor's accounts that Silas Corbett, comfortable in his inherited certainty, had forgotten to fear, that numbers, kept honestly, do not change their story no matter who is telling it. She and Otis Pruitt spent long nights at the courthouse annex cross-referencing Kell's ledger against the railroad's own surviving payroll records from 1857, records the company had never thought anyone would think to compare, and the withheld sums matched, column for column, laborer for laborer, a precision that no fabrication could easily counterfeit. Wing Lo, meanwhile, quietly gathered 3 other elderly men and women in the region, descendants of laborers named in Kell's careful hand, who were willing, for the first time in 30 years, to stand together and say plainly that the debt their families had always spoken of was real. The stakes, by the spring of 1888, had grown far larger than one widow's shack or one old crime. The Cutter's Notch spur was scheduled for formal abandonment at the railroad board's next quarterly meeting, a decision Corbett had all but guaranteed, and half the town's remaining businesses, the freight depot, the feed store, the little railside hotel, depended on that spur staying open. Selah understood, turning it all over in the quiet hours at Widow's Pass, that the ledger in her hands was not merely a weapon to defend herself with. It was, if used rightly, the means to save the whole town that had so recently, through fear and inertia, nearly let her die. The climax came at the county courthouse in Cutter's Notch on a raw morning in April 1888, at the very hearing Corbett had arranged to have Selah declared unfit and her property seized. She arrived not alone, as Thomas Vane and Silas Corbett had each separately assumed she would, but with Otis Pruitt carrying the original ledger and cross-referenced payroll records in a leather satchel, with Wing Low and 3 other elders of laboring families standing quietly behind her, and with a letter she had sent weeks earlier, on a hunch her father would have approved of, to the railroad's Eastern Board of Directors in Philadelphia, a letter that had, unbeknownst to Corbett, prompted the board to quietly dispatch an independent auditor to Cutter's Notch to review the Spur's finances before any final vote on abandonment, an auditor who happened to be sitting, unannounced, in the back of that very courtroom. Selah did not raise her voice. She had learned, watching Eli chart impossible grades through impossible mountains, that the strongest cases are laid down the way good rail is laid down, patiently, in a straight line, one true fact set after another until the way forward is undeniable. She laid Josiah Kell's letters before the judge, then the original ledger beside the railroad's own 1857 payroll book, the columns matching some for some in front of the astonished Eastern auditor, and she let Wing Low speak for himself about a father who had died young from the mountain's granite dust and never once been paid a fair man's wage for it. The county judge, suddenly aware that a railroad auditor from Philadelphia was watching him weigh a case built on nothing more than Thomas Vane's and Silas Corbett's convenient word, found his appetite for convenient rulings had considerably cooled. The petition to seize Selah's land was denied outright, and denied with unusual sharpness, the judge noting for the record that he found the county's earlier ruling against her, the one that had cast her out in the first place, deeply troubling in light of what the court had just heard. Silas Corbett's ruin, when it came, was not the theatrical kind. It was the quiet, mathematical kind, which suited the story better, because it was the same kind of ruin he and his grandfather had once dealt out to men who had no one to speak for them. The Eastern auditor, having seen the matched ledgers with his own eyes, opened a formal review into decades of Corbett family dealings with the line, a review that within the year found enough irregularity in Silas Corbett's own recent freight accounts to end his career with the company entirely, stripped of position and comfortable certainty in the same courthouse where he had once tried to strip an old woman of her home. Thomas Vane, watching a Philadelphia auditor take a sudden and unflattering interest in the entire county's recent land rulings, quietly abandoned his own claim to Eli and Selah's original homestead rather than risk his own conduct being placed under that same lantern light, and the property was restored to Selah's name within the month. But restoration, for Selah, was never going to end with getting her own house back, and this was the part of the story the town of Cutter's Notch would speak of for years afterward. She took the withheld wages, verified, documented, and finally acknowledged by a railroad board eager to distance itself from its own old sins, and rather than keep the sum for herself, she saw to it that every documented family, Wing Low's among them, received the back wages owed to their fathers and grandfathers, 30 years overdue but paid at last, in full, with the company's own formal written apology attached. What remained of Corbett's buried strongbox, recovered from the very spot marked on Josiah Kell's hand-drawn map. Selah donated toward keeping the Cutter's Notch spur open and building, beside the depot, a small schoolhouse open to every child in the district regardless of what language was spoken at their supper table, a building the town, in a vote that surprised even Selah, chose to name the Kell School, so that the watchman who had died protecting the truth would not be forgotten as easily as he had once been erased. It is worth sitting, for a moment, with where Selah Vane began this story and where she ended it, because the distance between those 2 points is the entire meaning of what she did. She began at 61 years old, cast out into a blizzard by her own husband's brother, in possession of $4 and a stubborn refusal to believe that a woman written off by her town was therefore a woman without worth. She spent that last money on a shack the whole county called cursed and worthless, a building nobody else would touch, in the very place she had nearly frozen to death. And it was precisely because she had been trained, since childhood at her father's forge, to distrust the world's easy verdicts about what was ruined and what was not, that she found, sealed inside those condemned walls, a debt 3 decades overdue and a truth a murdered clerk had died trying to protect. She did not use what she found to enrich herself, though no one would have blamed her if she had. She used it to pay men who had been dead for 30 years the wages their families had never stopped waiting for, to save a town's lifeline of rail, and to build a school where the next generation would learn, perhaps without ever quite knowing why, that no name and no story should be dismissed as too small to matter. That is who Selah Vane was, not a foolish old woman who spent her last coin on a worthless shack, but a woman who understood, better than anyone left in Cutter's Notch, that value does not vanish simply because the powerful decide to stop looking for it. Thank you for spending this quiet evening with us and with Selah Vane's story. If it moved you, we'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who needs a reminder that being overlooked is not the same as being worthless, and if you'd leave a comment telling us where you're watching from tonight. Before you go, we'd love to know, is there ever a time you found real value in something, or someone, that everyone else had already written off? We read every answer, and we love hearing your stories almost as much as we love telling them. Until next time, stay close.